So appreciative joy is, or mudita in Pali, is the third of the Four Brahma Viharas. And it's also known as the Four Radiant Abodes. As the antidote to jealousy and envy, appreciative joy appears to be the least discussed and perhaps the most difficult to cultivate. But as it carries the image, as we will see, of the morning sun arising also as sacred presence, it is a deeply integral part of the path, no less so than any of the other three Brahma Viharas. In the first chapter of Wise Heart, which you may have read, I highly recommend it, by Jack Kornfield, he tells the story of an enormous clay statue of the Buddha that once stood in a large temple north of Sukhothai, if I'm pronouncing it correct, Thailand's ancient capital city. He says, though not the most handsome or refined work of Thai Buddhist art, it had been cared for over a period of 500 years and become revered for its sheer longevity. Violent storms, changes of government, and invading armies had come and gone, but the Buddha endured. At one point, however, the monks who tended the temple noticed that the statue had begun to crack and would soon be in need of repair and repainting. After a stretch of a particularly hot and dry weather, one of the cracks became so wide that a curious monk took his flashlight and peered inside. What shone back at him was a flash of gold. Inside this plain old clay statue, the temple residents discovered one of the largest and most luminous gold images of Buddha ever created in Southeast Asia. The fact that the towering Buddha was actually gold and that somewhere back in time it had been covered with clay to protect it during periods of conflict and uncertainty had totally been forgotten by the monks and people of Sukhothai, or perhaps had never even been known, lost over the centuries to the upheavals of time and to the forgetting of an oral culture. This story is also an analogy how as we grow and face difficult times, we too can become armored under a layer of protective fear and identify with the clay. The sedimentation of our reactions to experiences arising from ignorance that feeds craving, ill will, and the delusion of our being separate and not enough. We too forget, or never even knew, that we embody a basic goodness, the radiance of our own awareness and loving Buddha nature. But through the power of remembering in the cultivation of mindfulness, we can recognize and let go of our reactivity, of the grasping and clinging that keeps us stuck, and to come into sacred presence with ourselves, each other, and the world. Shining the light of awareness into those spaces that feel edgy or broken, we too can discover the radiance of that inner gold and rest in the peace of a loving heart where we can see into the inner goodness and nobility of all beings for the maturing and full flowering of our own awakening heart-mind and liberating wisdom. The Venerable Analayo, a renowned scholar, draws on the simile of the sun and moon to describe the Four Radiant Abodes, with loving kindness or metta as the foundation, which, like the sun at midday, shines its rays on all, without any preference or attachment or selfish gain, giving its warmth and light to all who are receptive to it. And as the sun implodes or collapses into its center, radiating photons outward as sunlight, so too the loving heart of metta gathers within itself and radiates its boundless goodwill and kindness in all directions. When, over the course of the day, the sun begins to descend in the sky at dusk, the sunset is like the glowing heart of compassion when darkness is nearby. And compassion opens the heart to the suffering of the world, shining all the more beautifully and coloring the whole sky. And as the morning returns, completing the circle of the sun, appreciative joy is like the coming of dawn and the sunrise, when the birds begin to sing, breaking the silence, and dew is draped over the hills and the branches of the trees, and the earth sparkles like a diamond in the bright morning light. Just so, Analio says, is our willingness to rejoice in the virtues and good fortune of others, an expression of our radiant heart mind, free from jealousy and envy. Equanimity, in turn, is like the full moon, which reflects the sunlight and balances the other radiant abodes, to become the moonlight in a night sky free from clouds. But of all the radiant abodes, appreciative joy, as noted, may be the least discussed, and perhaps the most difficult to cultivate because of the dark clouds of insecurity obscuring its light within us all. When appreciative joy, like the early morning sun, does arise, we can fully receive and appreciate the happiness, good fortune, and virtue of others, which then becomes our own happiness, without the afflictions of jealousy or envy, and the greed, hatred, and confusion embedded within them. James Shaheen, editor and publisher of Tricycle magazine, shared that when they had decided to run a special section on jealousy and envy, as they had done with other afflictive emotional states, and tried to enlist stories from contributors, some claimed, quote, to have had very little experience with them. Perhaps. It may be as onerous and shaming for us to acknowledge jealousy or envy when they arise, as it is common and painful for us to feel either one. Thought to be disfiguring emotions, Shaheen writes, jealousy and envy are traditionally depicted that way, as green-eyed monsters or demons with barred teeth and horns, or with snakes twisting on their heads. Jealousy is described as the fear of losing something we already have and value, whereas envy arises from the fear of not having or not being enough. Some researchers have observed that envy is, quote, sparked by upward social comparison and centers on how people rate themselves in relation to others perceived as possessing some superior quality, achievement, or object. Someone also said, and I can't remember who, that if we really want to go to the school of misery, the first two classes that we should take are Comparison 101 and Judging 102, where we may feel inflated or deflated, one up or one down. As school kids, we probably have all taken both classes. I did, for sure, with my love of basketball and never getting past 4 feet 11 inches in height. It was tough. Although our phys ed teacher and coach very kindly let me become the manager of our girls' high school basketball team, so I could go to all the away games for the happy exchange of cutting up oranges at halftime, and handing out towels. And not the least, of course, a big title as well. Niels van der Ven, a psychologist at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, quote, subdivides envy into two categories, malicious and benign. Malicious envy is that nasty yearning that motivates someone to bring his or her competitors down, while benign envy is a constructive desire to move oneself up. In that light, my envy of my fellow teammates and all my friends with athletic prowess appears to have manifested as benign. So too, perhaps, my effort to play field hockey, which I recently saw described as a, quote, kiss-ass sport played mainly by girls in America who aren't afraid to run around in skirts and get hit by hockey sticks. Or, in my case, slammed by the small, hard ball chopped to my forehead. Carried off to the field, to the infirmary, I finally came to consciousness under the watchful gaze of our starched Canadian nurse, who told me affectionately but firmly that I was built like a hummingbird, not a hawk, quick, but too light to play hockey, unless I wanted to get my bird brain knocked out, and that was that. But the jealousy of a friend of a late arrival to our boarding school, who not only looked like Greta Garbo, but had caught the eye of my guy, was intense, turning me suddenly into a gorgon with teeth bared and snakes writhing on the top of my head. Until we realized that we both had more fun goofing off, acting out the parts of the Sharks and the Jets from West Side Story, very popular at that time, in our living room, than the painful drama of becoming rivals for a guy. Whereas jealousy, the fear of losing someone we value or love, is considered by some as somewhat justifiable, and benign envy, a twisted form of admiration in which the admirer feels one down, both are very afflictive states. Malicious envy, with its poisonous blend of hatred and greed, hatred, and clinging, is extremely toxic, and on the receiving end, experienced as more injurious than straight-up hatred. Envy is a form of hostility, however it manifests. But unlike its cousin greed, Joan Oliver Duncan notes, envy doesn't just crave the object of its desire, it taints the whole project, begrudging others what they have, and when all else fails, devaluing or destroying the desired object. This was the story of Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin and brother-in-law, who out of envy and revenge attempted to kill the Buddha on at least 3 different occasions, after he'd also led a coup and created a short-lived schism in the Sangha. As a young monk, Devadatta had developed psychic powers, but as his fame grew, so did his conceit and greed for worldly power, becoming a patron of the notorious Prince Ajatasattu, who was later to murder his own father, the benevolent King Bimbisara, who was himself a patron of the Buddha. When the Buddha had turned 72 years old after 37 years of teaching, Devadatta approached him 3 different times in front of a large assembly of monks, including the king, and asked the Buddha to hand over the Sangha of monks for him to govern, since the Buddha was now old, aged, burdened with years, and had come to the last stage of his life, where he could happily retire, no longer have to teach, and simply dwell in the bliss of the present. On the first 2 occasions, the Buddha told Devadatta, "Enough. Do not aspire to govern the Sangha of monks." As an early disciple of the Buddha, Devadatta, it has been surmised, probably knew that the Buddha had no intention of appointing a successor. Having shared his vision over the years of a leaderless community that would disperse after his death and govern themselves according to the principles of the Dharma. So when Devadatta made the same proposal the 3rd time, likely attempting to dissuade the Buddha of his vision, the Buddha answered swiftly that if he didn't want to hand control of the Sangha to anyone, not even to Sariputta or Moggallana, his senior and most trusted disciples, why should he give it, quote, to a wastrel and lickspittle like him? Buddha could be tough. Devadatta, nevertheless, rather, not surprisingly, swiftly left the hall deeply humiliated, but consumed with envy and a desire for revenge, which led to the loss of his psychic powers that he'd used to win the favor of the murderous Prince Ajatasattu, and to his own earlier death. At the end, as Devadatta became sucked down into the fires of hell, he cried out for the Buddha to forgive him, which the Buddha did without a moment's hesitation. But even the Buddha could not save Devadatta from the poisonous fruit of his own negative actions. The definition of a lickspittle, which is something I had to look up, is a groveling and devious person who will do anything to get ahead in their life and career, including licking the spittle of any superior. Who could help? Buddha was pretty graphic. It is a person who is at once flattering and servile, a fawning subordinate, who is also a toady and a snob, filled with a toxic mix of greed, hostility, and the clinging of a malicious envy. A Judas Iscariot to Jesus, and an Iago to Othello, and a Devadatta to the Buddha. In varying degrees, envy is also the ubiquitous day-to-day frenemy of teens and adults who I've worked with in therapy, who too often have described them as attending their schools, competing in their workplaces, gossiping in their churches, and living within their own families, as if everyone were fully beset by the blue meanies, the most envious and biggest killjoys of all, as we may remember from the Beatles, taking over Sgt. Pepper's Pepperland, where no one was permitted to enjoy anything, most especially music. I don't know if anybody remembers the Sergeant. Yes, okay. The blue meanies of all the radiant abodes are referred to as their near enemies, far enemies, and distant enemies. The near enemy of appreciative joy, what looks like it but is not the real thing, is frivolity, which lacks any depth of appreciation, and an exuberance or excitement which lacks authenticity, driven by some underlying anxiety or sense of deprivation in the face of someone else's happiness. The far enemy of appreciative joy is its opposite: resentment, jealousy, envy, derision, cynicism, and despair. Appreciative joy's distant enemy is aversion, boredom, indifference, and listlessness, and numbing out and pulling away. So despite our reluctance to speak of it, or even acknowledge the spark of any of the blue meanies within ourselves, in the face of another's happiness and good fortune, the range of jealousy and envy from benign to malignant appears to be as much a part of our mammalian genome as is our capacity to love, express empathy, and know joy. Even our cats and dogs get jealous. At least mine. When one cat jumps up on your lap, the other has to leap on top of him. Then your dog suddenly appears, throwing herself against your leg, asking for a back rub, as if there wasn't enough attention, love, or happiness to go around for everyone. The human brain, as we've learned, has its own built-in negative bias. When walking around in loincloths, if we saw anything coiled in the road ahead, our brain would leap to, "It's a snake," before it's a rope, Because if we'd presumed it was a rope and not a snake before cautiously checking it out, we could get bit and die a horrible death and lose the opportunity as well to pass down our genes from one generation to the next. Based on his studies of microfacial expressions and the evolution of emotions, Paul Ekman, whose work you may know, emphasizes that even complex negative feelings, such as jealousy and envy, may have adaptive functions. In the case of jealousy, to preserve the biological family unit long enough to raise their offspring before the intrusion of a rival who may not provide as much care or safety for them. From a Buddhist perspective, it is the ignorance of our perception of the self as a separate and fixed entity that creates the false self and the false other, and feeds our craving of wanting and not wanting out of a psychology of inner scarcity, of not having or not being enough. The act or admission of jealousy or envy, even to ourselves, is usually followed by the experience of shame, which is the penultimate emotional expression itself of the feeling of insufficiency or not enoughness. As with other emotions, we are all hardwired for shame, which is a kick. It arises paradoxically with our earliest experience of becoming a separate self, when the contentment of our infantile narcissism and going on being is suddenly interrupted by a no, or some other boundary that a parent or the world has suddenly set. In its non-toxic form, shame just lets us know that our being human carries its own limitations, that we can't walk on water like you know who, or fly off of rooftops on our own. If we didn't learn that we had constraints, we clearly wouldn't survive as a species or develop empathy for others with their own strengths and limitations, which is likewise essential for survival. The co-arising of shame of our not enoughness with our experience of becoming a separate self may also be one of the earlier experiences we have of dukkha, where nothing provides any lasting satisfaction, where everything is impermanent and changing, and where the unfolding of our life is contingent on a multitude of known and unknown causes and conditions. Hence our desire and craving of wanting and not wanting, which continues to cycle feelings of not enoughness and separation like a needle on a vinyl record, deepening the habitual and neurological grooves of greed, hatred, and confusion. Or conversely, as we begin to mature spiritually, that desire could be responded to as a different cry of the heart when we can develop a radical curiosity and kindness to lean into and directly experience the pain for its release and our waking up. When we can come into the sacred presence of each moment, whether it is experienced as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, the clay of our armoring begins to crack and fall away, letting the light of our Buddha nature through in the fullness of its fundamental expression, the heart's deepest longing to be free, to experience itself as the unfolding mystery of the universe itself. It is then possible, in the words of Zen Master Dogen, to begin to see through the dark layers of our conditioning and learn that to, quote, study the self is to forget the self, and that to forget the self is to let the false self-liberate and fall away, to become enlightened by the myriad of things, breath by breath. It is in these moments that the generosity and natural radiance of the awakening heart-mind can shine like the sun at noon, sunset, and daybreak, even more brightly through the darkness, and we can be happy no matter what. The light of the sun is also the thread of joy, of selflessness, and peace that runs through all the radiant abodes. The selflessness of our aspiration that all beings be well, that they be free from suffering, that we can appreciate and participate in their happiness, and that we can rest in the contentment and deep peace of equanimity and imperturbability. Under the skillful guardianship of mindfulness, which balances the 7 factors required to cultivate awakening, joy follows investigation and energy and leads to tranquility, concentration, and equanimity as an essential factor of the path. Joy is also the product of mindfulness itself, arising out of our ability to come into sacred presence with ourselves, where we can draw out the poison of jealousy and envy in our heart, as a hummingbird or a butterfly draws out the nectar from a flower for its transmutation into the gold of what is benign, wholesome, and contributes to flourishing. Those qualities of virtue, goodness, and skill that we admire in others, which have given rise to their own happiness, we might also cultivate or simply appreciate as they manifest in them. Likewise, when we participate in the joy of another's good fortune, we can also clarify what it is that we value. Whether the good fortune appears to be deserved or not, or the individual even presents with hurtful and deceitful behaviors, to share in their joy for its own sake helps us to keep our own hearts open and spacious and free to take in the good, to see into the goodness of others, that they too have a Buddha nature, however clouded that may be, and the same longing of all beings to be loved and to belong. Attending to the goodness of others, no matter what, is not to be blind to any harm that they may have caused, including to themselves or to oneself, nor is it to put oneself in harm's way. But it is to see them in the wholeness of their being human, with the same potential to awaken as any other. The Buddha spoke harshly to Devadatta, humiliating him in front of others, which triggered a deeper sense of Devadatta feeling wronged and not enough, escalating his own passion for revenge that led to his downfall. In the short run, we can hear that the Buddha's words were not wise speech. But if the Buddha had said those same words to another in front of an entire assembly of devoted practitioners, the Zen whack he gave to Devadatta might have brought a less incorrigible man to his knees, waking him up not only to the harm he could do to others, but to the profound negative impact of that harm on himself. To see into the goodness of another is not to act out of what is called an idiot compassion. All these right speech words. Minimizing, making excuses, or enabling, or avoiding and dropping into one's own rabbit hole, nor assigning a dark motive to another who may have had to call someone out. When we can see into the basic goodness of another, no matter how deeply buried it may be under the clay, we can also act with the greater compassion of the Buddha, with clear comprehension as to the nature of our own intention and the courage to speak truth, if not harshly, at least wisely, for the benefit of that being and others. Because of our negative bias, we have, as it's also said, a Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive. We pay attention more to what's not working than what is, and tend to overlook the nuances of wholesome joys in our own lives and the lives of others. And what we pay attention to, we grow, not only in the present moment, but over time. When we strengthen our mindfulness through formal and informal practice, we can also train our ability to be awake at the sense doors and with the Vedana, the primary feelings, a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, as they arise, to offset the craving and clinging that may follow. In that, quote, space between the stimulus and our response, in the words of Viktor Frankl, that space between Vedana and craving is the space where we also have the power to choose. And in that choice lies our growth and freedom. Whether we choose to feed unwholesome thoughts, beliefs, and stories about ourselves or each other that keep us stuck, or those that help us to become free and find true happiness, which is an inside job. True happiness is not dependent on phenomenal events inside or outside of us, of which we have very little control, but in how we respond to them versus react, which is also a choice guided by our intentions. If our intention is to live fully in the mystery and beauty of this precious existence, we do have a choice with each breath again and again to start over, to pay attention to what is wholesome and what is not, and in that process act out of our basic goodness to deepen old positive neural pathways and create new ones, which also grow themselves. When we come into sacred presence with ourselves and each other, we can also grow the wisdom embedded within appreciative joy, as it is also in metta, compassion, and equanimity, that puts under erasure the perception of the self as a fixed and separate entity. The wisdom that the self is selfless, dependent on the co-arising of causes and conditions, and the joy of that realization is the greatest gift that we can give to ourselves and to each other. This is the wisdom and gift of cultivating appreciative joy, known also as selfless joy, which, as in the Metta Sutta, is boundless and without attachment and without preference or distinctions of any kind. As a mother cares for her own child, so too with all beings, including those who walk on all fours, fly through the air, swim in water, crawl on land and through the earth, or stand with their branches pointing to the sky, or their flowers leaning toward the sun. It is a selfless joy that is also fed by all other joys, the day-to-day happiness of inclining ourselves toward the good and our deepening of gratitude. Selfless joy can also be fed by the meditative joy, contentment and equanimity arising from the jhanas, and from the joy of samadhi in general, which also reshapes neural pathways. Whatever practices we engage in, the arousing of appreciative joy is a process of deepening attention, generosity, and wisdom through sacred presence, in which we slowly evolve from a narrow and self-interested attachment to those we love and can easily appreciate, to the boundless joy and freedom of letting go of the self in the selfless realization of a non-dual and deepened connection with the happiness of all beings, Stephen Batchelor shares that he'd originally titled his last book, After Buddhism, as the Solar Buddha, clarifying that the Buddha grew up in an agrarian community, not in North India with the Brahmins. He was the son of a Sakyan, whose creation myth was that they had descended from the sun. And throughout the Buddha's life, he was known both as capital F, the friend, and capital K, kinsman, the friend and kinsman of the sun. Batchelor writes, he likewise compared any true friend, a kalyanamita, to the first light of dawn. For in the same way as the dawn is the precursor of the rising sun, a true friend precedes one's cultivation of the noble eightfold path. Through both example and teaching, the true friend encourages the sun to arise in another's life. The sun, in this case, is nirvana, which is beheld as soon as the dark clouds of habitual reactivity are momentarily dispelled from an individual's mind. Such moments open up the possibility of leading a life that is no longer conditioned by impulses of greed, hatred, and confusion. So as we close this evening, the invitation, which I hope you will take, especially when I do our little treat, is to hold the image of appreciative joy as the morning sun, arising as sacred presence within ourselves and with each other, where we can let go of reactivity and dispel the clouds that lead to pain and confusion. And as the morning sun offers its warmth and light to all without distinction, so too we can radiate the love and wisdom of appreciative joy to all beings as fellow kinsmen and friends of the sun, like the Buddha, and the sun itself, a symbol of awakening.